Welcome back to another video for the IB Environmental Systems and Societies course. Today's topic is 2.4 Biomes, Zonation, and Succession. In my previous video, I went over the distribution of biomes around the world, and today we're going to focus on these two concepts of zonation and succession. So let's get started with a couple of definitions. First, zonation refers to changes along what's called an environmental gradient. It's actually it's a spatial change across the landscape. So how do different abiotic factors and living organisms change from point A to point B? A really clear example of this is as you move from lower altitudes, so lowlands, up into the mountains. The community of plants and animals that you find there change as a result of different environmental factors. We see a very similar change as we move from the equator to the poles as the light and temperature inputs change. Right? So all of these communities, even though they're different composition, they exist at the same time. So it's just a change along the landscape. Whereas succession is a change in the communities of organisms over time. So zonation is spatial, succession is based on time. So our first big idea in topic 2.4 about succession and zonation is that succession leads to something called a climax community. And it always follows this same sequence, beginning from bare rock to the climax community. And at each point in time, there will be different stable states within that moment in time. Succession is a process of change over time, and it involves three different kinds of communities that you need to know: pioneer, intermediate, and climax communities. Climax is what we would call kind of the long-term stable state community that will exist in the landscape without any type of disturbance. In this visual here, you can see there was some type of a disturbance, either natural or human caused. This looks to be some type of fire. And so the very first populations that move in, the very first communities of plants and animals, are your pioneers. They grow fast, they reproduce quickly. If they're plants, they tend to be sun tolerant because there's very little shade in a disturbed site. As they grow and they capture as much sunlight as possible, they tend to shade the ground, which makes it possible for your intermediate species to move in. Those are your plant and animal species that will thrive in some combination of sun and shade. As they continue to grow and get larger and produce more and more shade and contribute more and more nutrients to the soil, you can develop a late intermediate stage of succession where the pioneer species tend to get out-competed by the longer growing, slower reproducing K-strategists. And ultimately, you get a return to a climax community that is stable over a long period of time. During succession, the changes in productivity and diversity on a particular site change over time. That's what succession is. So in this graphic, we have the moment of succession, and across to the right, we have the amount of time after succession. This is usually measured in many years and may go as long as several decades or even several centuries after a disturbance. So after the disturbance time, this is when all of your pioneer species come in. Very rapidly growing species, so you have very high productivity. So it's not very stable because your pioneers are growing quickly, they're dying quickly, they're being replaced rapidly. So it's a highly unstable environment, but they're adding biomass quite quickly. There's also a lot of competition during this initial stage of succession. And so you have a lot of plants and animals competing with one another. It's kind of a free-for-all for sunlight and the limited resources that are available on a location to establish dominance. And so initially you have this explosion in productivity and diversity as your pioneers and your intermediate species establish themselves, right? and you get higher levels of biodiversity in a site, then the levels of productivity begin to fall, as does the diversity, because at this point your intermediate stage species have moved in and they've outcompeted the pioneers. So the pioneers have now died off. The longer the site remains undisturbed, the higher the amount of biomass and the greater its stability. So the diversity may decrease and the overall productivity may decrease. After the initial peak in productivity and diversity, and the intermediate species have outcompeted all of the pioneers, because they are dying off, you see a drop in diversity. And because you have longer living plants and other producers, the overall productivity tends to follow that same pattern as diversity, and it drops off. That's net productivity, because the biomass continues to increase. So productivity is increasing, but so is respiration. So the net productivity falls. The whole system becomes more stable. So its stability increases the longer it remains undisturbed, because those battles for resources such as sunlight, water, space have largely been settled, and your longer living K-strategists begin to dominate. Greater habitat diversity creates greater species and genetic diversity. The more habitats you have, that means you have greater variety of the abiotic factors in your environment, which create more ecological niches. And the more ecological niches you have, create more opportunities for different species to thrive and survive in a particular area. This graphic showing the diversity of bird species in Nevada in the United States does a really clear job of showing the correlation between the diversity of the habitat and the biodiversity of living organisms there. So up here in the top right, you have the most diverse habitats supporting the greatest number of bird species. Your least diverse habitats down here also support the smallest number of bird species. Here's two keywords you absolutely must take away from this part of topic 2.4. R-strategists and K-strategists. These are called reproduction strategies. Your R-strategists essentially are your pioneer species. They tend to be found in extreme or unstable environments. They generally reproduce really quickly. They create a lot of offspring. Most of their offspring will not survive to maturity. They kind of thrive by having this overshoot and die back. The idea is by producing as many offspring as possible, that they kind of overwhelm the predators or the landscape, ensuring that at least a few of those offspring survive. They invest very little, if any, energy in the survival of any one individual offspring. Your K-strategists, on the other hand, tend to be found in very stable environments. They don't have nearly as many offspring. They don't have offspring as frequently. They tend to be larger organisms. So humans and elephants are great examples of K-strategists. They tend to live longer. They invest more energy in ensuring the survival of each individual offspring. So these are very different reproductive strategies. BioNinja has a great graphic that shows this scale, right? Oysters may produce 500 million offspring every year, and a tiny, tiny fraction of those will actually survive to reproduce again. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have primates such as chimpanzees who only produce one offspring or two offspring every few years. So they invest a lot of time and energy and resources in ensuring that each individual offspring survives. We can see these differences graphically. The red line here are your r-strategists. Right? They reproduce extremely rapidly, they overshoot the carrying capacity of the environment, and they suffer extreme dieback. Then they reproduce really rapidly again, and so they tend to have these really wide fluctuations in population levels. Whereas the K-strategists reproduce very slowly over time, and as they approach the carrying capacity, their populations will fluctuate somewhat, but they remain very close to the carrying capacity. Over the course of succession, initially what you'll have is a lot of r-strategists and very few, if any, K-strategists. And over time, the ratio of r-strategist to K-strategist falls and ultimately reverses. So you begin with a lot of r-strategists, very few K-strategists in the early stages of succession. Towards the later stages of succession and in the climax community, you'll have fewer, if any, r-strategists, and the community will be dominated by long-living K-strategists. In early stages of succession, where you have a disturbed site and we have the pioneers are just beginning to move into an area, the gross productivity is quite low. Right? The conditions might be extreme. There might not be much soil available. It might be too sunny, and so plants actually will be sunburned and diminish the amount of photosynthesis that they can perform. But they're growing very, very rapidly. So the net productivity is high. So you have all kinds of new growth that's happening and not a lot of respiration from existing biomass. In later stages of succession, where we have more established producers, you tend to have a very small amount of net productivity. So initially, what you have is a lot of growth and adding new biomass. And once that new biomass has become established in the ecosystem in later stages of succession, then your respiration rates increase. Therefore, the difference between net and gross productivity diminishes. So you'll have a lot of biomass, and a lot of biomass requires quite a lot of respiration to stay alive. That is why the net productivity decreases throughout succession. In previous slides and topics, we've discussed this idea that biodiversity and ecosystem stability are intrinsically linked. Generally speaking, the more diverse an ecosystem, the more stable it is. That holds true in succession. Right? So succession leads to a complex climax community. And as you can see from this diagram of a bunch of different nutrient and energy flows, the more complex the food web is, the more complex the community of organisms is, the greater the variety of pathways through that. And the greater the varieties are, the more stable the ecosystem is. There is no such thing as a single climax community. It's not a static equilibrium. A climax community is like a patchwork in the forest of multiple different mini communities, all in different stable states. And together, collectively over a larger area, they make up what we call the climax community. In one part of the forest, there might be a lightning strike or a tree that falls down in a storm that creates an opening in the canopy, allows more sunlight to go in. And so that particular place in the forest reverts to an earlier stage of succession as the sun-loving r-strategist plants move in and grow rapidly to fill in that gap in the canopy and capture that suddenly available sunlight. Whereas a different part of the forest may continue to grow and be dark and shady and cool, thus preventing the r-strategist from moving in. Over time, that previously disturbed site will become the climax community, and there may be another disturbance over here where the process repeats itself. That's what we mean by a dynamic, stable state equilibrium. People, as always, can divert or change or interrupt the process of succession. We've typically done this through the use of fire and agriculture, and more we're doing it through large-scale deforestation. The image that you see on the screen shows a place in Denmark that was previously an agricultural site. It hasn't been farmed in about 45 years. And so the forest site, or climax community, is rapidly replacing the grasslands that people brought in through the use of agriculture. That agricultural area represents an earlier stage of succession. Again, we're going to repeat this big idea that an ecosystem's capacity to survive change depends on its diversity. Really clearly here, you have a disturbed site with a more forested site in the background, this disturbed site becomes less stable. There are fewer energy and nutrient pathways. The physical environment, the abiotic components of the environment are exposed and are not protected by the diversity of tree species that are growing there. So this valuable natural resource of soil will be lost every time it rains. Succession is one of those topics that shows up on almost every year's ESS examinations. You should be able to describe the process of succession in very clear, simple steps. Initially, you have bare rock with no soil at all. Through a long, slow process of weathering, the rock begins to break up. And as it breaks up, dust and small soil particles are blown in by wind. And your earliest pioneer species began to grow very slowly. And as they go through multiple generations of their life cycle, they contribute more nutrients or organic matter to a very thin soil layer. Those additional nutrients make it possible for slightly more complex organisms to live there. And as they go through multiple generations of their life cycle, they continue to add more and more organic matter. The bedrock continues to weather as water moves downwards through it, and you begin building more and more complex soils. The more complex soils support more complex plant forms, and those more complex plant forms contribute more and more organic matter. What you end up with is a positive feedback mechanism that takes place over many, many years. This is one of the only examples of a positive feedback mechanism in nature that's actually beneficial and helpful to the environment. You should be able to explain the general patterns of change in communities undergoing succession, moving from bare rock to your pioneer species and that initial layer of soils that allows grasses and other rapidly growing r-strategists to grow, who are then eventually replaced by your intermediate species, and then your intermediate species, because they keep adding more and more nutrients to the soil, support the development of a climax community, usually of trees. Discuss the factors that can lead to alternative stable states in an ecosystem. Think of these factors as miniature disturbances. Generally, you're going to have things like isolated fires. You might have small scale logging or farming in a large landscape. You might have things like a big storm that comes through and blows down some of the trees, creating gaps in the forest canopy. As long as those are happening on a patchwork basis here and there, and not all at once across the entire landscape, what you have are alternative stable states that combined create the climax community. Again, we're going to come back to this idea that greater diversity provides multiple energy and nutrient pathways through an ecosystem. That makes it more stable. In succession, the later stages of succession, when a site has been undisturbed for many years, has greater stability because it has a wider range of energy and nutrient pathways. And the connection with that is that human activities can interrupt or disturb that succession and revert it to an earlier stage. You should be able to distinguish between your r-strategists and your K-strategists and their roles in succession. Early succession, your pioneer species are almost all r-strategists. In the intermediate stages of succession, you have combinations of r-strategists and emerging K-strategists. That's why diversity tends to be quite high in the middle stages of succession. And at the end of succession, or in later successional stages, towards the climax community end of the curve, you have communities that are dominated by K-strategists who live longer and reproduce more slowly. You should be able to look at a model such as the one on the screen here and interpret it. You should be able to identify whether it's representing succession or zonation. This graphic shows zonation because it shows a change in the community of species across the landscape. All of these different communities exist at the same time. So it's not succession, it's zonation because they change with their distance from this sandy beach, because the abiotic factors in the environment change as you move farther and farther away from the beach. That's it for zonation and succession today. Please be sure to give my video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel so I can reach more ESS students around the world. If you like this, you can find more ESS resources over at my website, www.mrcreamerscience.com. Thanks for watching, and happy learning.